Princess Anne allegedly told Queen Camilla directly to get exactly out of a room, and the entire explosive incident apparently started exclusively because of a small lapel pin that an 8-year-old boy was desperately holding on to exactly like his tiny life depended entirely on it. That is the entire bizarre story. That is the exact cinematic moment. And exactly when you actually look critically at exactly what was officially said by the palace versus exactly what undeniably happened behind closed doors, the neat, official version of that tense afternoon makes absolutely no logical sense whatsoever. Because the terrified palace absolutely didn't officially confirm a single solitary detail for exactly 2 full days. And then, when they finally did, the absolute only weak response they had was that Camilla abruptly missed a massive official event strictly due to a boring scheduling matter. A scheduling matter. That is exactly what they lazily went with. Meanwhile, the damning pictures entirely from that exact day are completely already out there in the public domain. And exactly if you aggressively zoom closely in exactly on young Prince Louis's formal blazer, you can clearly see exactly what the massive, family-shattering fight was entirely about. Before we dive deep into the specific, boring document that definitively proves the strict rule Camilla was ruthlessly enforcing absolutely did not even exist, take exactly a second to firmly subscribe to my channel. We meticulously break down the exact stories the panicked palace deeply hopes absolutely everyone completely forgets by Friday evening. It genuinely helps the channel, and honestly, it keeps me aggressively digging entirely through the boring, dense paperwork exactly so you absolutely don't have to. So, let's carefully set the exact scene, precisely because the specific timing of this incident is absolutely the entire story. It is a highly private, elite family gathering occurring directly before a massive, highly publicized official function. You've got absolutely all the senior royals mingling nervously entirely in the grand reception rooms, highly trained staff moving silently through completely with silver trays, anxious aides tightly holding thick folders, and absolutely everyone politely pretending to sip the exact same glass of warm white wine exactly for 30 long minutes exactly, while the massive armored cars get meticulously organized entirely outside. It is the massive grinding machinery entirely of the ancient monarchy running exactly as it has, completely for 100 long years. Absolutely nobody argues loudly exactly where absolutely anyone else can hear them. Tense disagreements get quietly noted entirely in a private secretary's secure diary, politely handled completely in a soundproofed side room, and eventually come smoothly out the absolute other end exactly as a highly vague, meaningless PR statement entirely about mutual respect. That is the rigid system. And then you specifically have Prince Louis. He is exactly 8 years old. He is the absolute youngest of William and Catherine's 3 highly scrutinized children, and completely unlike absolutely all the royal generations directly before him, he is actively being raised completely by exactly 2 modern people who definitively decided that their own kids were actually going completely to be allowed entirely to feel real things entirely out loud. William and Catherine have been aggressively, carefully building this massive protective wall completely around their children entirely for years. The young kids go to school exactly like perfectly normal kids. They get formally photographed exactly twice a year on their terms. They are absolutely allowed entirely to loudly say they are completely tired. They are absolutely allowed entirely to loudly say they absolutely don't want to do something. And they are absolutely allowed entirely to loudly miss someone they absolutely never ever met. That absolute last part is the exact crucial key entirely to absolutely everything that ultimately happened entirely in that grand drawing room. Princess Diana tragically died entirely in 1997, significantly more than 20 long years completely before Louis was ever even born. He has absolutely no personal memory entirely of her. He absolutely never will. And yet, her specific presence is deeply in that massive house absolutely every single day, precisely because William aggressively made absolutely sure of it. He specifically does it entirely through prominent photographs placed carefully on side tables, completely through warm, personal stories told gently at bedtime, completely through incredibly small, deeply personal objects that explicitly belonged entirely to her and have been meticulously kept completely for the exact, specific purpose entirely of being lovingly handed down to them. That is absolutely not a slick PR press strategy. That is exactly a traumatized man who walked numbly directly behind his own mother's heavy coffin exactly at 15 years old, aggressively making absolutely sure his own young children absolutely never, ever have to coldly put her memory completely away. And entirely on the specific morning, entirely of this massive event, William quietly gave his absolute youngest son exactly something. An incredibly small, highly vintage silver lapel pin. It absolutely wasn't checked out completely from the massive, heavily guarded royal vault. There was absolutely no bureaucratic inventory number physically engraved on it, absolutely no fussy curator officially signing it completely out entirely of a glass case. It was an incredibly modest, highly personal silver pin that explicitly belonged entirely to Diana, completely in the early 1990s, kept intensely privately entirely by William, completely for long years. Now, exactly here is the specific part I genuinely find incredibly interesting. William absolutely didn't give it entirely to Louis explicitly on a birthday, or exactly at Christmas, or entirely on absolutely any specific date completely with a massive, heavy meaning attached entirely to it. He casually gave it entirely to him completely on a perfectly ordinary morning directly before a boring work event, which clearly tells me he desperately wanted it entirely to be completely ordinary. He desperately wanted the young boy entirely to simply have his beloved grandmother's pin safely tucked exactly in his own pocket, exactly the specific way absolutely any normal child casually has their grandmother's special something safely in their own pocket. Absolutely no grand ceremony. Absolutely no big, emotional speech. Just a highly quiet, deeply personal piece entirely of family continuity. And Louis, simply being exactly 8, is constantly, nervously checking exactly on it. He's repeatedly putting his tiny hand completely flat directly against his formal jacket, exactly the specific way you do exactly when you're nervously carrying absolutely something that deeply matters entirely to you, and you simply haven't completely gotten entirely used entirely to securely having it yet. That is his absolute whole entire crime, a small boy proudly wearing his dead grandmother's tiny pin completely inside his absolute own jacket. Then Camilla sharply noticed it. And this is exactly where the entire story violently stops entirely being completely about a tiny lapel pin and rapidly starts entirely being completely about exactly who Camilla deliberately chose entirely to speak to. Because William was standing exactly right there. Catherine was standing exactly right there. Absolutely either one of them could have been quickly, politely taken aside completely in exactly 4 seconds. The harsh, public correction deliberately went directly to the young child. She walked aggressively straight entirely past absolutely both parents and stopped deliberately entirely in front of the 8-year-old. She coldly told him the personal keepsake was absolutely not appropriate entirely for a young prince explicitly to wear exactly at a highly official function. She deliberately put it entirely in strict terms, completely of rigid court protocol, highly formal dress standards, exactly the specific way things are properly done. And she deliberately said it entirely in front of absolutely everyone, busy staff walking with silver trays, anxious aides holding thick folders, completely other senior members entirely of the extended family, standing a mere 6 feet away completely with drinks casually in their hands. A small, vulnerable boy actively being told entirely in front of absolutely all of them that absolutely something exactly about him was completely, inherently wrong. Then she aggressively went significantly further. She loudly insisted the tiny pin be immediately taken entirely off and handed completely over entirely to palace staff specifically for safekeeping, strictly on the specific grounds that highly personal family mementos have absolutely no place entirely in a highly public-facing, formal court environment. Now, desperately try entirely to truly hear this specific interaction exactly from exactly where the young boy was standing. He's exactly 8, a highly senior, incredibly imposing adult, unarguably one of the absolute most powerful people entirely in the massive building, is standing aggressively directly over him, coldly telling him that absolutely something completely on his own jacket is fundamentally wrong and absolutely has to be instantly taken completely off him and immediately given directly to a total stranger. He absolutely doesn't know exactly what abstract protocol is. He absolutely doesn't know exactly what a rigid dress standard is. He intensely knows exactly one specific thing completely with total absolute clarity. His beloved father gently gave him exactly this that very morning, and exactly now absolutely somebody aggressively wants to completely take it entirely away. So Louis desperately tried entirely to hold completely on entirely to it. He bravely explained it exactly the specific way absolutely any normal 8-year-old explains absolutely anything, which is to say incredibly honestly and incredibly badly. His father gently gave it completely to him. It was his beloved grandmother, Diana's. He desperately wanted entirely to strictly keep it specifically so he could always remember her. He bravely told a massive room completely full of staring adults exactly why the tiny object deeply mattered completely in the absolute plainest, simplest language available entirely to him, and it completely changed absolutely nothing. That is the exact moment it absolutely could have easily ended. Exactly one compassionate adult entirely in that room gently saying, "Of course, sweetheart, keep it. Off you comfortably go." And this explosive video absolutely doesn't ever exist. And absolutely nobody completely outside the tight household absolutely ever hears a single whispered word completely about it. But Camilla absolutely didn't soften her harsh stance. She absolutely didn't politely step completely back and gracefully let the young boy's parents gently handle it entirely quietly, completely in the exact next room, which is exactly what absolutely any of us would have instinctively done. She reportedly aggressively doubled down entirely, loudly saying strict palace rules entirely on highly formal dress were absolutely, completely absolute, and that absolutely no individual exceptions were actively being made entirely for anyone. Think deeply about the cruel arithmetic entirely in that specific sentence. An absolute rule, coldly applied entirely to an 8-year-old completely over a tiny pin, exactly the size of a small fingernail, entirely in a highly private room, completely before absolutely anyone had even officially left the massive building. And honestly, that is exactly the specific part that completely gets me. It instantly stopped entirely being completely about a tiny lapel pin, the absolute exact moment the frightened child honestly told her exactly where it came completely from. Because entirely after that specific sentence, absolutely everybody completely in the quiet room instantly knew exactly what was pinned to his jacket and exactly whose it had historically been. Louis finally broke. He was genuinely frightened entirely by her harsh tone, deeply confused completely by the massive pressure, and absolutely terrified that the exact thing his father had deeply trusted him completely with, that very morning, was exactly about entirely to be aggressively taken completely off him entirely by an imposing adult he simply couldn't possibly argue completely with. He tightly closed his small fist entirely around the tiny pin, turned sharply and frantically ran completely out entirely of the grand drawing room specifically to desperately find a quiet corner entirely of the long corridor, exactly where the staring guests absolutely couldn't clearly see him crying. And that is precisely exactly when Princess Anne abruptly came completely around the exact corner. Those massive corridors are incredibly long and incredibly cold, and there is absolutely nowhere completely in them entirely for an incredibly small person exactly to effectively hide. He got exactly about halfway completely down and abruptly stopped completely by a large window purely because there was absolutely nowhere completely else entirely to possibly go. The exact timing completely here is the absolute entire story. Exactly 10 seconds completely either way, and this massive incident gets instantly smoothed entirely over, heavily handled entirely quietly, and completely buried exactly the specific way this secretive family has successfully buried 1,000 toxic things. Instead, the highly formidable Princess Royal quickly walked completely into a quiet hallway and abruptly found her young great-nephew completely, with his small face entirely in his tiny hands and his shaking shoulders actively going. She gently asked him exactly what happened. He honestly told her. He told her completely, in the highly broken-up, messy way an 8-year-old tells you absolutely anything, exactly when he's absolutely still crying. And she gently crouched completely down and patiently waited completely until he had entirely finished. Then she quietly asked him exactly one more specific time exactly who had harshly said it. He honestly told her exactly that as well. Now, think intensely about exactly what she was actively walking directly into. Her powerful brother's new wife, the reigning queen, standing in a grand room completely full entirely of senior aides and extended family exactly 30 minutes completely before a massive official function, completely with the official cars already perfectly lined exactly up completely outside. Absolutely every single instinct that massive building rigorously trains completely into a royal person clearly says, you politely deal entirely with exactly that, completely later, entirely quietly, strictly through the highly proper bureaucratic channels. Anne absolutely didn't do exactly that. She absolutely didn't go and quietly find his angry mother first. She absolutely didn't politely go and find a senior member completely of staff and discreetly ask exactly what the tense situation was. She directly got the raw account completely from the crying 8-year-old, instantly, absolutely believed him completely, and aggressively walked exactly back the specific way he had violently come. Anne is absolutely not a woman who slowly works completely up entirely to difficult things. There was absolutely no polite diplomatic run-up, absolutely no quiet, polite inquiry, entirely to a senior member completely of staff, absolutely no polite request entirely for a highly private word completely later. Stunned witnesses vividly describe her actively walking aggressively, straight completely across the massive room, abruptly stopping entirely directly completely in front entirely of Camilla, and aggressively going completely in entirely with absolutely nothing held completely back entirely at all. How exactly dare you actively hurt him? Then exactly 2 specific words that instantly went completely down the long corridor and violently stopped absolutely every single polite conversation entirely in the massive building. Back off. She fiercely told Camilla directly in front entirely of staring aides and shocked family that aggressively enforcing cold, rigid protocol completely on a vulnerable child who was simply carrying a private memory entirely of his dead grandmother was absolutely not acceptable completely inside a family, and that it absolutely never, ever had been. She deliberately said it entirely at a perfectly normal volume. That is exactly what absolutely people who were physically there repeatedly keep coming entirely back to. Absolutely no loud shouting, absolutely no flashy theater, just a completely terrifyingly level voice coldly saying the absolute worst, most devastating sentence absolutely anybody entirely in that room had absolutely ever heard said completely out loud to her. Then she coldly said it exactly again, completely in even fewer words, exactly the specific way she famously does exactly when she has definitively decided a conversation is permanently finished. Back off. Absolutely nobody completely in that grand room said a single solitary word. A senior aide literally stopped completely mid-sentence. And honestly, completely from absolutely everything I've absolutely ever read entirely about exactly how that rigid household operates, I genuinely don't think a single isolated person entirely in there had absolutely ever seen a reigning queen officially spoken completely to exactly like that, entirely in their entire working lives. Now, exactly to deeply understand exactly why that massive confrontation landed exactly the specific way it did, you desperately need entirely to truly understand exactly what Anne essentially is completely inside that massive building. It has absolutely almost nothing whatsoever completely to actively do entirely with her formal rank. Her specific rank is arguably the absolute least entirely of it. And honestly, formal rank is almost entirely irrelevant completely in that specific room. She is the absolute only biological daughter entirely of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. She has been tirelessly working completely for the heavy crown entirely since long before exactly, most entirely of the massive staff completely in that room were even born. The highly official court circular totals completely for exactly last year formally put her entirely on exactly 478 highly official engagements, actively against the reigning king's 532. She is exactly 75 years old, and she easily, consistently outworks people exactly half her age, and absolutely every single working member completely of that massive household intimately knows it. She also fiercely declined the absolute one massive thing absolutely everybody completely else entirely in that ambitious family constantly reaches hungrily for. Long decades ago, she explicitly asked that her absolute own children be formally given absolutely no royal titles completely at all. They officially have absolutely none completely to exactly this very day. Think deeply about exactly what that profound choice means. She has spent her entire, long life entirely inside a massive institution, completely built entirely on fancy titles, and fiercely refused entirely to actively spend its cheap currency completely on her absolute own kids. Anne confidently stands completely up, and absolutely nothing formal happens completely at all. The formidable Princess Royal officially holds absolutely no legal authority whatsoever, entirely over a reigning queen, and absolutely everybody completely in that grand drawing room intimately knew it. But she undeniably has exactly 50 long years entirely of absolutely never ever, exactly once using the massive family name purely for her absolute own personal benefit. And that is exactly why the massive room went utterly silent, entirely, instead, completely, of aggressively arguing directly back. There is absolutely no personal ambition completely inside that massive family entirely for her. Absolutely none. She is absolutely not desperately competing entirely for a bigger role. She is absolutely not aggressively building a massive position. She has absolutely nothing completely at all entirely to gain completely from absolutely any petty argument entirely in absolutely any room. So exactly when she fiercely stands completely up, absolutely everybody physically present intimately knows she is absolutely not actively doing it entirely for herself. And that is undeniably the absolute most dangerous, terrifying thing absolutely anybody completely in that massive institution can possibly be. There is exactly one massive more piece entirely to this puzzle, and it matters significantly more entirely than the absolute rest entirely of it completely put entirely together. Anne genuinely, deeply knew Diana properly. The flashy documentaries absolutely never, ever got completely anywhere closely near the truth of it, but the actual working relationship completely between those exactly two women was highly real. Exactly two highly distinct people who absolutely both deeply understood exactly what that massive grinding machine ruthlessly does, completely to absolutely somebody who simply doesn't perfectly fit its rigid shape. They were absolutely never incredibly close entirely in the specific way the public imagines, but they deeply mutually understood exactly each other completely. Those exactly two facts are absolutely not completely in conflict. She intensely watched exactly what that massive machine brutally did entirely to Diana, completely from a significantly closer distance entirely than almost absolutely anybody else. She was physically entirely in the massive building completely through absolutely all entirely of it. Completely through the long years the ravenous newspapers brutally ran the messy marriage entirely across their massive front pages, completely through the bitter divorce, completely through the tragic funeral. She absolutely never ever gave a single interview entirely about absolutely any completely of it, and she absolutely never will. She was absolutely not merely defending a tiny lapel pin entirely in that grand drawing room. She was fiercely standing entirely on a massive line that had been brutally crossed a incredibly long time entirely before that specific afternoon, and she deliberately picked the exact moment entirely to finally say so completely out loud. The explosive story leaves boring protocol entirely behind, completely at exactly this point, precisely because absolutely somebody completely in that panicked household actually went and frantically checked the official paperwork. Somebody completely under my absolute last video astutely wrote that the elite royals absolutely never technically break a strict rule. They unilaterally decide exactly which specific rules actively exist exactly that specific morning. I absolutely haven't been entirely able completely to get that brilliant line entirely out completely of my head, entirely since I actively started intensely looking exactly at this highly specific incident, precisely because absolutely every single official function entirely of that massive kind invariably comes completely with a highly specific, highly detailed dress instruction. It is an incredibly boring, highly restrictive document. It routinely goes entirely around absolutely all the massive households significantly in advance. It explicitly says exactly what the men formally wear, exactly what the women formally wear, exactly what the children formally wear, and exactly whether military decorations are explicitly worn. It exists absolutely so absolutely nobody ever turns completely up exactly wrong. It gets widely circulated days entirely ahead, specifically so that absolutely nobody accidentally arrives entirely in the completely wrong thing, and gets humiliatingly photographed actively being the glaring odd one completely out. Absolutely every single household gets a strict copy. Absolutely every single private secretary meticulously reads it. It is undeniably the absolute most unglamorous, boring piece entirely of paper completely in that entire massive building. And it quickly settles massive arguments specifically because it's the absolute only objective thing absolutely anybody can legally point entirely at. Somebody frantic finally pulled the specific instructions specifically for exactly that function. There was absolutely no such rule. I meticulously read it exactly twice. I aggressively went actively looking entirely for the highly specific sentence that absolutely would have legally justified exactly what brutally happened, precisely because I naturally assumed it was definitely buried in there completely somewhere and had simply been highly badly, overzealously applied. Absolutely nothing entirely in that massive document said absolutely anything completely about highly personal tiny keepsakes. Absolutely nothing explicitly prohibited a young child entirely from quietly wearing a highly personal family item. Absolutely nothing officially required absolutely anything entirely to be immediately handed over completely to staff specifically for safekeeping. The tiny pin actively broke absolutely no formal dress standard, absolutely no strict protocol, absolutely no rigid palace regulation, precisely because absolutely no such regulation actively existed completely for exactly what an 8-year-old child quietly wears completely inside his absolute own jacket. I carefully read that specific fact, and I absolutely had entirely to go completely back entirely over the tense sequence exactly twice, precisely because it completely turns the absolute whole afternoon entirely inside completely out. Absolutely every single harsh word deliberately spoken entirely to that crying child completely in that grand drawing room was entirely built completely on a massive rule that simply did absolutely not exist. The absolute palace regulation, the strict standard that formally admitted absolutely no exceptions, the massive thing that absolutely could completely not ever be bent entirely for exactly one 8-year-old. Absolutely none entirely of it was ever written completely down entirely anywhere, explicitly because there was absolutely nothing completely to actively write down. Sit heavily, completely, with exactly that specific realization entirely for a second, precisely because it completely changes the entire, absolute shape entirely of the tense afternoon. Camilla absolutely did not merely ruthlessly enforce a strict rule completely on that terrified little boy. She completely invented exactly one entirely in the absolute middle entirely of a grand drawing room and aggressively enforced it entirely on the absolute only single person completely in the massive room who simply could absolutely not formally check her authority. And exactly once that devastating realization came completely out, the massive question instantly stopped entirely being completely about boring dress codes and abruptly started entirely being completely about the specific pin itself. Absolutely nobody has officially confirmed exactly what was rapidly going completely through Camilla's mind exactly when she sharply saw it, and absolutely nobody intimately involved is absolutely ever going entirely to. The specific pin clearly dates entirely from the early 1990s. Diana famously wore it prominently, entirely in exactly that highly publicized period. Camilla was deeply inside that messy story, completely from the absolute beginning, and intimately remembers exactly those volatile years significantly better entirely than almost absolutely anybody alive. Absolutely nobody has absolutely ever officially confirmed a single word entirely of exactly that. And I genuinely want entirely to be completely straight entirely with you exactly that. This specific next part is entirely me actively reading the tense sequence heavily, rather entirely than directly quoting absolutely anybody. That is simply my absolute reading entirely of it. She absolutely didn't simply see a minor dress code violation completely on that young child's formal blazer. She instantly recognized the specific thing, precisely because a legitimate dress code argument actually has a very specific shape. It's incredibly slow. It politely goes officially through a senior private secretary. It gets politely raised formally exactly with the parents. It gets quietly, smoothly settled, completely in a back corridor, entirely in exactly 30 seconds, entirely by exactly two highly professional adults who have flawlessly done it 100 times. This specific confrontation was incredibly instant. It aggressively went straight completely past absolutely both protective parents. And it absolutely did not immediately stop exactly when the crying child honestly gave the highly emotional reason. Think deeply exactly about exactly how much perfect sense exactly that specific realization makes entirely of absolutely everything completely else. It perfectly explains the aggressive speed. It perfectly explains exactly why she aggressively went entirely to the young boy entirely, instead completely of respectfully speaking to his parents. It perfectly explains exactly why she absolutely wouldn't respectfully step completely back exactly when he honestly explained exactly where it came completely from, because the highly emotional explanation was exactly the massive problem. Absolutely every single second exactly that highly recognizable pin deliberately stayed completely on his jacket, entirely in a grand room, completely full, entirely of highly senior royals and watching staff, was exactly a second entirely in which Diana was highly quietly but undeniably present, exactly at a massive official function, directly through her absolute own grandson. An 8-year-old child bravely walked completely into that massive room, actively wearing his dead grandmother, and the specific woman who had exhaustively spent 30 long years heavily living completely in exactly that specific woman's massive shadow, aggressively reached entirely for an absolute authority she simply did absolutely not have entirely, to ruthlessly get it completely off him entirely, before the flashing cameras waiting completely outside could ever see it. That is exactly the specific reason the bold title entirely of this video explicitly promised you. Absolutely not a boring dress code dispute. Absolutely not just a minor, difficult afternoon. A grown, highly powerful woman deliberately looked exactly at a tiny silver pin completely on a small child's blazer. Intimately knew exactly what it was and exactly whose it had historically been, and aggressively reached entirely for a massive authority she simply did absolutely not possess entirely to get it completely off him entirely before the flashing cameras completely outside could possibly see it. And exactly when the panicked household rapidly worked exactly that devastating fact completely out entirely over the highly tense following days, they frantically went completely through those massive corridors significantly faster entirely than absolutely any official communication absolutely ever has. William arrived exactly there, entirely before absolutely any completely of that massive fallout officially surfaced. Loyal staff had frantically gone entirely to desperately find him the absolute exact moment the crying boy frantically ran, which clearly tells you exactly something massive entirely in itself, completely about exactly where the true loyalties actively sit, completely in that massive building. Absolutely not a highly paid private secretary, absolutely not a formal duty officer, absolutely not the slick press office, A completely ordinary member entirely of staff clearly saw a terrified child crying and actively went straight entirely to his protective father. That is a highly small thing exactly that loudly tells you an enormous amount completely about exactly who exactly those people genuinely work entirely for, completely in their absolute own heads. He frantically found Louis standing miserably completely by a large window exactly at the far end entirely of the long corridor, absolutely still heavily shaking, absolutely still desperately holding the tiny pin completely in his small palm, entirely with his tiny fingers tightly closed completely over it. William gently crouched completely down and patiently let him slowly get the absolute whole confusing thing completely out entirely at his absolute own pace. He absolutely didn't coldly tell his young son entirely to be brave entirely about it. He absolutely didn't falsely tell him it was merely a misunderstanding. He patiently let an 8-year-old slowly finish an entire sentence completely at his absolute own speed, which understandably took exactly a while, precisely because the young boy was absolutely still actively crying. Then he slowly stood completely up and purposefully walked aggressively entirely into the grand reception room, exactly where Anne and Camilla were absolutely still standing, tensely facing exactly each other. And he absolutely didn't politely do the exact thing absolutely every senior royal is highly trained entirely to constantly do. He completely skipped the polite smoothing entirely over. He completely skipped the fake, let's absolutely all quickly move completely on and politely get completely through the massive afternoon. He deliberately offered absolutely nobody completely in that massive room a polite diplomatic exit. The furious Prince of Wales deliberately stood solidly exactly next entirely to his fierce aunt. He quietly said it incredibly quietly, completely from exactly what I deeply understand, and he deliberately said it entirely to the massive room, actively rather entirely than exclusively to absolutely any, exactly one specific person completely in it, which is somehow infinitely much worse entirely for absolutely everybody awkwardly standing exactly there. He aggressively made it incredibly crystal clear entirely to the massive room that absolute decisions completely about his own children's highly personal keepsakes, and specifically exactly about exactly how his own children quietly remember their dead grandmother, absolutely belong exclusively entirely to him and completely to Catherine, and entirely to absolutely nobody completely else entirely in that massive building. Absolutely no formal office, absolutely no senior advisor, absolutely no highly senior member entirely of the extended family has absolutely any legal right whatsoever entirely to aggressively police it. Honestly, exactly if you desperately want exactly one single definitive moment, exactly that loudly tells you exactly what the massive next reign truly looks exactly like, exactly that is absolutely it. His father had painstakingly spent exactly 50 long years carefully managing highly toxic situations exactly like absolutely that, entirely by politely saying exactly as incredibly little, exactly as humanly possible. William deliberately walked completely in and aggressively drew the massive, unyielding line directly in front entirely of staring witnesses, exactly so that Anne flawlessly finished exactly what she bravely started. She slowly turned completely back entirely to Camilla and coldly told her entirely to immediately leave the massive room. She absolutely wasn't politely asking. The formidable Princess Royal coldly told the reigning queen entirely to immediately get completely out entirely of the grand drawing room, directly in front entirely of staring aides, directly in front entirely of the furious Prince of Wales, directly in front entirely of panicked staff, who will undeniably be enthusiastically telling exactly that explosive story, completely for the absolute rest entirely of their entire careers. There was absolutely no screaming scene. That is exactly what precisely makes it entirely so infinitely much worse completely for her. A massive room completely with exactly maybe 15 important people actively in it. Highly paid aides rigidly holding thick folders. Busy staff completely by the heavy door entirely with the massive car list. Her angry stepson standing solidly directly beside her furious sister-in-law, and absolutely nobody completely in that massive room said a single solitary whispered word entirely in her defense. Absolutely not exactly one. Absolutely not even the highly paid people exactly whose specific job it is absolutely to actively say absolutely something entirely in her defense. And Camilla completely, humiliatingly went. The panicked staff completely outside frantically had entirely to rapidly redo all the massive arrangements entirely while she was absolutely still physically in the massive building. Heavy armored cars rapidly reordered. The highly choreographed line entirely of formal arrival hastily changed. The specific name abruptly lifted completely off a master list, and the massive list frantically reprinted. Absolutely all entirely of it actively happening completely in a long corridor she inevitably had entirely to humiliatingly walk completely down, simply to get entirely to her absolute own private rooms. She absolutely did not publicly appear exactly at the massive function exactly that specific afternoon. The weak, official line smoothly fed afterwards to the press was exactly a scheduling matter, which is exactly the empty phrase exactly that specific household reliably reaches entirely for exactly when there is absolutely nothing completely else remotely available. Her specific name quietly came completely off the official arrangements. The massive cars were hastily reorganized, and the massive event smoothly went completely ahead entirely without her, and the reigning king absolutely did not actively reverse a single solitary part entirely of it. Charles suddenly arrived entirely into the absolute middle entirely of absolutely all entirely of it. Desperately put absolutely yourself completely in his impossible position exactly for a moment, precisely because it's genuinely the absolute worst possible position entirely in that massive building. His angry wife completely on exactly one side, his formidable sister who has absolutely never, ever exactly once, backed completely down entirely from him, completely in exactly 75 years, completely on the other, his furious heir standing solidly directly beside his sister, and a terrified, crying grandson entirely somewhere completely down the cold corridor. He had exactly about 90 agonizing seconds entirely to decisively decide exactly who he was officially going entirely to, completely be entirely in exactly that long corridor, completely with panicked staff, exactly at absolutely both ends, entirely of it, desperately pretending entirely to be highly busy.